Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at dealing with multiple exceptions. So we're going to look at throwing multiple exceptions from a method, and we'll also look at handling them as well. So I've got a basic program set up in Eclipse, and I'm going to also create a new class here, and let's call this test, and I'll click finish, and I'll create just a dummy method here. And I'll give it a name. Let's make it public void, and let's just call it run, just to pluck a name out of the air. And let's imagine that run throws some exception, or it could throw an exception, because you are very rarely going to have a method that automatically throws a exception unless it's some sort of not implemented exception. But let's just imagine that we've detected some error and then we want to throw a new, let's say, IO exception. Now I'm going to have to add a throws clause here, so let's just click the error and import IO exception, click it again, and then add the throws declaration. So if you throw an exception, or you think you might want to, then you're going to have this throws and the exception name there. But what if you want to throw another exception, because it may be that this exception doesn't get thrown in your code because this particular thing doesn't go wrong, but it could be that something else goes wrong somewhere in your code. So let's comment that out. So maybe we've got through the input-output stage and we didn't throw IO exception, but now another error occurs in the same block of code and we want to throw a new, let's say for example, parse exception. So we want to say error at line, error, or maybe just error in command list or something like that. I'm just kind of making this up. This could be a line number, let's say. So you might throw a parse exception if, for example, you're parsing some kind of list of commands or something and they don't conform to the kind of format that you expected. And I've got unhandled exception. Let's click on the error and go to add throws exception. And what this has done is now we've got a comma separated list of exceptions here, and this is not a list of exceptions that we're going to throw, because you can only throw one exception at a time, and of course you might not throw any exceptions, hopefully, if the code is successful, and that will, you expect that to be normally be the case, that you won't throw an exception. But what this is saying is that you could throw either one of these two exceptions if something goes wrong in the code. So these are two separate things that could go wrong, and you'll throw an exception as appropriate. So this is not obviously not working code because I've just commented this out, but you imagine that you detected an error and you've decided to throw one of these exceptions. So this is basically a comma separated list, and your particular method, it might throw any number of possible exceptions. So let's have a look now at how you'd actually handle that. I'll create a object here of the type test. So test equals new test. And so we want to call test.run. And now I'm forced to handle those exceptions because test.run could throw either of two exceptions, although it might not throw any if we're in luck and it runs smoothly. So we've got a bunch of different options for handling that, and we've already seen the add throws declaration option, which would throw this out of main. In this case, it throws it up the stack to the next method in the kind of hierarchy of method calls. And here we're in the main method, so we're not within a sub kind of method. And here we'll be throwing it directly out of the main method, which will produce some kind of stack trace if that error gets thrown. Now let's assume that you don't want to throw it out of main, you want to handle it. You've got two choices. Well, actually there's more than two choices really, which we'll get into. And the first thing you could do is surround with try catch, because although you've only got one try block in your try catch block, you can have multiple catch blocks, and depending on what error's thrown, you'll get into one of these blocks. So in this case, I'm actually throwing a parse exception at the moment. So I could say here sysout couldn't parse command file or something. I'm just making up text here. This has no relevance to this program. And if we run this, then we get the error because we've thrown the exception, and we've got this specific catch block has run rather than this one, because the catch block will match its argument here to the actual exception that's thrown. So this catches IO exceptions and this catches parse exceptions, and we've thrown a parse exception, so we've run this code here. That's one possibility. Let's comment this out, and you'll find this code on caveofprogramming.com. So I'll comment this out in case you want to have a look at it. And let's try that again. Let's do test.run, because there's another way that we can deal with that. And this second way was introduced in Java 7, and it's called a try multi-catch. So if I click the error here, I can say surround with try multi-catch, and now we've got a single catch block, but it lists two possible exceptions, and there's a pipe in the middle of them. And as far as I know, you can have multiple exceptions there, although I don't actually use this much myself. And there's the actual variable, which is the actual exception that we could use if we want to print a stat trace or get the error message from the exception. So this can handle multiple exceptions in one catch block, and that's the try multi-catch. There is something else you can do, however, because let's just close that. Let's say test.run again, because we've seen this concept of polymorphism, which means that you can always pass a child class wherever a parent class is expected, and that means let's surround with a try catch, and let's get rid of one of the catch blocks here. Now, because all exceptions derive from the parent class exception, if I change this to exception, it can now catch any kind of exception, because this is a parent class, and we could use any child class here where the parent class is expected. An IO exception and parse exception are child classes of exception. So just like with passing methods to a parameter, for example, to a method, for example, did I say that right? Just like with passing parameters to a method, we could catch any exception by using a parent class here. Whichever exception's thrown, this catch block is going to say, okay, the exception that we want to look at catching is a kind of exception, therefore we can catch it with this block. And that brings me to a little complication here, because supposing I've got a method here, public void, let's call this something like I don't know, input. And now let's say that input throws IO exception, and it also throws, well, what I actually want to do is I want to make it throw an exception that's a child of IO exception, and there are a lot of them. So let's go to a browser here and let's look at exception, and I'll look for IO exception in here. Click on IO exception, input output exception, and we've got a lot of more specific exceptions here, like for example file not found exception. So let's imagine that this can throw IO exception for some reason, but it could also throw a file not found exception. And I'll just add the import there for that. So I won't implement this because there's no need for this example. But now if we think about how to handle that, and so I go to app here, imagine that we're running test.input, which throws file not found exception, or it might throw IO exception. And imagine that I put in here a surround with try catch. We have to have file not found exception first, and the reason for that is that if we had IO exception first here, then IO exception would catch file not found exception as well. So what happens is Java works down the catch blocks and says, does this match the exception? If yes, we'll run this code. If it doesn't, let's look at this catch block. Does this match the exception? If yes, then we'll run this block. And if we were to have IO exception here and file not found exception here, then it would say, okay, this is, even if it throws a file not found exception, it would say, okay, file not found exception is an IO exception, it's a child class of it, and it would run this, and we would never reach this. And for that reason, I think if we were to say here, file not found exception, and I were to put IO exception here, I think it won't even compile. So I'd save that, and it will say here, unreachable catch block, and that's because we've handled them in the wrong order. And although this might seem like a nitpicking point, being as let's just redo that because I didn't want to delete it. Redo. Being as the compiler won't even let you type it. The thing is, they ask you this on exams and in interviews all the time. So it's if you think you might sit an exam or take an interview, it's worth understanding that if you've got a child exception, you've got to handle that first before the parent, because otherwise the parent would catch it due to polymorphism. And I think, in fact, with try multi-catch, if we say test.input and we say here surround with try multi-catch, I think it won't even let you do it. But I'm not sure because I don't really use this much. And it's saying now here that file not found exception is already caught by IO exception, so it won't even let you handle it with a try multi-catch apparently. So that's it for this tutorial, and we're going to look at exceptions a bit more because there's still a bit more to learn, but not too much, fortunately. So join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.